What is up, ladies and gentlemen? This is Kensei Sensei, and in today's lesson, I'm going to be talking about causative verbs, passive verbs, and causative-passive verbs in the Japanese language. Now, at first glance, you may be confused by these three verbs, but in this lesson, I'll be carefully explaining each and every verb so you can understand and use them in your Japanese conversations. So to get started, let me explain to you what a causative verb is. A causative verb in the Japanese language is when you are making someone do an action, or you are letting someone do an action. The important concept to understand here is the fact that we are talking from the perspective of making someone do an action. So basically the subject in this case is the person who is making someone do a specific action. So in order to get the causative form in the Japanese language, we have to conjugate verbs. Now if you can remember, we conjugate verbs in the Japanese language by categorizing verbs into two, ichidan verbs and godan verbs. So with godan verbs, we change the last vowel to a or a, and then we add seru. So an example would be kaku, which is to write. Kaku turns into kaka, and then we add seru, kakaseru, which means to make someone write or to let someone write. How about ichidan verbs or ru verbs? Taberu means to eat. We remove the last ru and then add saseru. So taberu turns into tabe and then tabesaseru. Tabesaseru means to make someone eat or to let someone eat. And of course we have irregular verbs like suru, which turns into saseru, and kuru, which is to come, which turns into kosaseru. Now with irregular verbs, you just have to know their causative forms by memory. Now let's look at an example sentence. 先生は学生に発表をさせた。先生は学生に発表をさせた。This sentence basically translates to the teacher made the student give a presentation. Now the most important concept to grasp with causative verbs is the subject. Who is making someone do an action? In this sentence, it is the teacher or the sensei that is making someone do an action. So therefore, we specify who is making someone do an action using the sentence particle wa, which is the subject particle. Sensei wa学生に, and after that, we specify who is on the receiving end of the causative action. In this case, it is the student. The student is made to do an action. The student is made to do a presentation. Therefore, 学生に発表をさせた. To put it all together, 先生は学生に発表をさせた, which is the teacher made the student do a presentation. Now let's move on to passive verbs. Passive verbs, on the other hand, is when you're talking from the receiving end of an action. So basically, someone does something to you. In order to get the passive verb in the Japanese language, we go through the same conjugation steps as when we get causative verbs, except we add reru or rareru. So with godan verbs, we change the last vowel to a or a, and then we add reru. So kaku turns into kakareru. And then for ichidan verbs like taberu, we remove the last ru and then add rareru. So taberu turns into taberareru, which means to be eaten. Now notice that to be eaten in English is again speaking from the perspective of the receiving end of an action. So I'm on the receiving end of being eaten. Let's take a look at an example sentence. 知らない人に写真を撮られた。知らない人に写真を撮られた. This sentence translates to a stranger took my photo, or I had my photo taken by a stranger. Now, the important part is that we are on the receiving end of the action. We are talking from the perspective of having our photo taken. Therefore, we use the target particle ni to specify who is doing the action rather than the person who is receiving the action. It is the opposite of when we're using causative verbs. So therefore, the person who is doing the action is the stranger, 知らない人. Therefore, we use the sentence particle ni, 知らない人に, and then we add 写真を撮られた, which means to have your photo taken. So, if we put it together, 知らない人に写真を撮られた turns into I had my photo taken by a stranger. Let's take a look at another example so you don't get confused. 弟は先生に怒られた。弟は先生に怒られた. Here, you can see the use of the sentence particle wa. Now, unlike causative verbs, remember with passive verbs, we are speaking from the perspective of the receiving end of an action. Therefore, we specify the person that is on the receiving end of the action using the sentence particle wa, which is the subject particle. The person who is on the receiving end is ototo, or little brother. If we translate this sentence, it turns into, my younger brother was scolded by the teacher. And therefore, the person who is on the receiving end is the little brother. And we use the sentence particle wa to specify that. Now, how about the person that is doing the action? Because we're using the passive verb, we use the sentence particle ni, or the target particle, to specify that the teacher is the one that is doing the scolding. The teacher is the one that's doing the action, in other words. Therefore, 弟は先生に怒られた, and we use the passive verb. 怒る means to be angry. 怒られた means to get scolded. Now let's move on to the last part of this lesson, which is causative-passive verbs. Causative-passive verbs are basically a combination of causative verbs and passive verbs. The most important part is that this time we're on the receiving end of the action, like passive verbs, except we are talking about how someone makes you do something, or basically you are made to do something by someone else. In order to get the causative-passive verb, you basically conjugate a verb to its causative form first, and then we apply the passive conjugation. So let's take a look at an example. We have the godan verb yomu. Yomu means to read. We first conjugate it to the causative form, which is yomaseru, and then we conjugate yomaseru using the passive conjugation steps. We remove the last ru and treat it like a ru verb, and then add rareru, so it turns into yomaserareru. Now let's look at an example sentence. 子供たちは宿題をさせられた。子供たちは宿題をさせられた. Now this sentence translates to, the children were made to do homework. Now remember, causative-passive verbs are used from the perspective of the receiving end of the action. Therefore, we specify the receiver of the action using the sentence particle wa. In this case, it is the children. The children are the one that are being made to do a specific action. In this case, to do homework. Therefore, 子供たちは宿題をさせられた. We specify the receiving end using the wa sentence particle. Now let's look at another example. 私は上司に遅くまで働かされました. This sentence basically means I was made to work late by my boss. Now again, who is on the receiving end of this action or this causative-passive verb? It is I. I am the one that is made to work more or to work late. And who is the one perpetrating the action? Who is the one doing the causative action? That is the boss. Therefore, we specify that using the sentence particle ni, which is the target particle. 私は上司に遅くまで, 遅く means late. 遅くまで means until late or up until late. And then 働かされました, which is to be made to work. Therefore, if we put it all together, 私は上司に働かされました means I was made to work late by my boss. Now, as you can see, causative verbs, passive verbs, and causative-passive verbs are used differently in the Japanese language. And depending on which verb you are using, we specify who's doing the action using different sentence particles. So with causative verbs, we're talking from the perspective of the person that is doing the action or is making someone do an action. We use the sentence particle wa to specify who is making someone do an action. Whereas if we are dealing with passive verbs or causative-passive verbs, we're speaking from the perspective of the receiving end. So therefore, whatever comes before the wa sentence particle is the person who is on the receiving end rather than the person who is giving or making someone do an action. But that's the end of this lesson. If you've learned something new, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to participate in my Japanese to English language exchange Discord server, make sure to check out the link below. But until next time, mata ne!